Good evening, everyone. I'm Ed Gallagher. I'm president of the American Scandinavian Foundation. I'm very pleased to welcome you to Scandinavia House, the Nordic Center in America, for this, the first program in Nordic American Connections, Conversations on Architecture and Design, a four-part series organized by ASF with Susan Chin of DesignConnects, in collaboration with AIA New York and AIA Continental Europe. This series brings together leading architects, critics, and scholars to explore the long-standing influence of Scandinavian and Nordic design on American architecture and design from the 19th century to today. This program is part of the ongoing celebration of the 25th anniversary of Scandinavia House. Since its opening in October 2000, Scandinavia House has welcomed more than 3 million visitors and presented over 3,000 programs. Over the years, Scandinavia House has remained committed to building international cooperation and understanding through educational and cultural exchange, fully in keeping with the mission of the American Scandinavian Foundation, founded in 1911. I've been asked to say a little about Scandinavia House, the building itself, before we begin. I was named president of ASF in November 1996, with the mandate to create a cultural center for ASF, which for many years had operated out of a townhouse on East 73rd Street. Shortly after my arrival, the board decided to buy this property at 58 Park Avenue, which was occupied by a townhouse, beautiful townhouse actually, owned by the East German government, who was no longer in business. We closed on the property early in 1997 and began the search for an architect, inviting proposals from about a dozen firms and also having an open competition. Among the firms who submitted proposals were Robert Stern, Hugh Hardy, Stephen Hall, and many others. After a thorough review of preliminary proposals, we settled on Jim Polshek, who impressed the committee with a number of his earlier designs, notably the Siemens Institute in downtown Manhattan, as well as his strong feeling for Scandinavian architecture, rooted in the years he spent studying in Denmark in the 1950s. The committee felt that Jim had a unique grasp and feeling for Nordic design and its sensibility. I found it a great pleasure working with him over the 3 years really, before we opened the building, and traveling to Scandinavia with him and his wife Ellen to look at buildings and meet with architects, historians, and donors seeking inspiration and funds. Jim later summed up his approach to Scandinavia House when he wrote, "We hoped to develop a unique identity that would celebrate both the differences and the shared experiences of the participating countries. Scandinavian architecture has long been characterized by a mastery of material, texture, and detail, firmly rooted in the craft of traditional building. Nordic architects of the recent past, including Aalto, Saarinen, Lorentz, and Asplund, provided inspiration, as did contemporary practitioners such as Henning Larsen and Sverre Fehn." I think Jim accomplished his ambition admirably as we celebrate the 25th anniversary of Scandinavia House, building which has not really been changed in any way in 25 years except for a little alteration in the gallery, and we all take great pride in it. Our thanks go to Susan Chin for her help in bringing this series to life, and to AIA New York, AIA Continental Europe, and DesignConnects for their partnership. This is the first of 4 lectures. The series continues on January 15th, 2026. The topic will be Nordic in New York City, established and newer. March 19th, 2026, we have Women in Nordic Design and Architecture, Crafts Meets Industry. And on May 14th, Next in Nordic American Architecture is the title. I should explain that Susan's not with us tonight because she's in Rome, poor thing. Tonight's program, like all 25th anniversary programs, are supported through the Monica and Charles Heimbold Fund for Exhibitions and Programs. And I'd like to turn things over to our moderator, Rosalie Genevro, known to many of you as an architectural historian and urbanist, who has been an active participant in New York's architecture and civic communities for over 4 decades. She led the Architectural League of New York as executive director from 1985 to 2023, originating many programs, publishing, and engagement projects, such as the Urban Omnibus and American Roundtable. She has served and serves on a number of boards and is an adjunct faculty member of the New York-Paris program at Columbia GSAPP. Rosalie?
Hi, everybody. So I'm really pleased to be able to participate in this celebration of 25 years of Scandinavia House and the many ways in which the Nordic countries have contributed to contemporary culture. Scandinavian architecture has been such a fertile source of inspiration for some of the best impulses in modernism. Those impulses including close attention to how resources are used, the play of light, the importance of craft, a sense of groundedness and profound engagement with the site, and more broadly, a deep humanism as the wellspring for design are particularly attractive in our current moment, and I'm really looking forward to hearing our speakers talk about them and then discussing them. In terms of format, I'll introduce all three speakers together who will each then make a short presentation about how Scandinavian design has affected their thinking and work, and then we'll have time for discussion. So our first speaker is Peter MacKeith, who is Dean and Professor of Architecture at the Fay Jones School of Architecture and Design at the University of Arkansas. Peter's had a very long and rich connection to Finland, beginning with a Fulbright Fellowship in 1990. From 1995 to 1999, he directed the Master of Architecture International Program at the Helsinki University of Technology. His first book, he's published 14 books, was The Finland Pavilions, Finland at the Universal Expositions, 1900 to 1992. He curated lighthouses on Nordic common ground in the Nordic Pavilion in Venice for the 13th Architecture Biennale in 2012, which brought together the work of 33 architecture practices from Finland, Sweden, and Norway. Peter conceived and curated the 2017-18 exhibition, The Iconic and the Everyday, Creative Finland in the United States for the Finnish Embassy in Washington. He does many things as Dean of the School, including being a leading proponent of a forest-centered culture and economy and of a wood product-centered approach to architecture, engineering, and construction. And he's done a great deal of work in Arkansas to promote economic development opportunities for the state's timber industry. This relates to Finland, in my mind at least, including working with the production team of the PBS series America's Forests on 2 episodes devoted to the Arkansas forests and forest communities. He was instrumental in commissioning Grafton Architects, working with Moda Studio of Fayetteville to design the Anthony Timberlands Center for Design and Materials Innovation, which just opened earlier this month, I think, a new mass timber building on the University of Arkansas campus that serves as a regional center for research and development of new wood products and new approaches in sustainable construction materials. Tod Williams, our second speaker, founded the New York firm Tod Williams, Billie, Tsien Architects Partners with Billie Tsien in 1986. The long list of notable projects of the firm include the renovation of the public spaces in Geffen Hall at Lincoln Center, the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, the Asia Society Hong Kong Center, projects from many academic institutions, including Cranbrook, Princeton, Haverford, Dartmouth, Phillips Exeter, and the University of Chicago, as well as the James Baldwin Library at the MacDowell Colony in New Hampshire, the Frederick Mayer Gardens in Grand Rapids, and the campus of Tata Consultancy in Mumbai. Their current work includes the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City, which I think is to open fully open later this year, and the Obama Presidential Center in Jackson Park in Chicago, opening in 2026, as well as a building for the arts for undergraduates at the University of Arkansas. Tod's has been active as a teacher over the course of his career, including 15 years teaching at Cooper Union. He's held the Eliel Saarinen Chair at the University of Michigan, the Louis Kahn Chair at Yale, and the Thomas Jefferson Chair at the University of Virginia. He was a Rome Prize Fellow in 1982 and is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the National Academy of Design. And the work of the firm has received many awards and prizes, including the Premium Imperiale from the Japan Art Association and the National Medal of the Arts from President Obama in 2013. Our third speaker, Thomas Phifer, Since founding Thomas Phifer and Partners in 1997, Tom's completed a number of major cultural buildings, including very recently the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw, as well as an expansion of the Glenstone Museum in Potomac, Maryland, an expansion of the Corning Museum of Glass in Corning, New York, and the North Carolina Museum of Art in Raleigh, North Carolina, as well as projects at Rice University and Indiana University. Current projects include the T.R. Warsawa Theater in Warsaw, an artist retreat in Maine, and the Wagner Park Pavilion downtown, which is part of the resiliency efforts at South Battery Park, of the South Battery Park City Resiliency Project in Lower Manhattan. Tom received the Rome Prize in Architecture from the American Academy in Rome in 1995 and was awarded the Medal of Honor from the New York chapter of the AIA in 2004. He too was a member of the National Academy of Design and the American Academy of Arts and Letters. And very recently, as the latest in many honors over the course of his career, Tom received Architectural Record's inaugural Architect of Record Award, which was established to recognize an exceptional career and body of work. Also notably, in 2022, the Clemson University School of Architecture, which is Tom's alma mater, announced a newly endowed fellowship for historically underserved and underrepresented students. The Thomas Phifer Fellowship supports tuition in the School of Architecture for 2 graduate students for 2 years in an effort to increase access and broaden a more diverse pathway within the profession of architecture in South Carolina. So with that, Peter, over to you, and then we'll just go from there.
Can you hear me in the back? Yes? I lecture so frequently to undergraduates, I'm hopeful that your ears are similarly energized. It's a great pleasure to be here. For all that Rosalie has just said about at least myself, and I'm privileged to be standing next to Tod and to Tom both, perhaps the most relevant piece of information in my biography now for this evening is that I'm the honorary consul for Finland, one of many across the United States, and in particular now the honorary consul for the region, the heartland as we call it. Missouri, Kansas, and Arkansas. Oklahoma belongs to Texas, but nonetheless, this is an exercise in international relations, which actually was my first degree as an undergraduate. But it's an exercise in international relations through architecture. And I think that's what brings us together tonight, is to encourage our mutual understanding between the great nations of the North and our own nation here, wherever we come from, whatever we bring to it. Excellent. An actual microphone can be used. So let's enter into that spirit of mutual understanding. You are all, at least for the moment, honorary consuls from wherever you've come from into the Great North. I'm going to begin with a quote from Ólafur Eliasson, Icelandic, at least in part, sculptor, artist, architect, who was profiled in the New Yorker in 2006 and was asked about his own roots coming to bear upon his own work. And he brought up very quickly his roots in the Nordic context, saying that the 20th century Nordic presumption is that art and design, Arne Jacobsen chairs, Dansk tableware, Marimekko textiles, Alvar Aalto buildings, are integral to how people perceive and inhabit their surroundings. And this sets out an intrinsic relationship between design, whether we think of that as the built environment or the design natural environment, maybe even whether you think of it as the universe is giving us or God giving us the natural environment, the intrinsic relationship between design and who we are as people, as individuals, communities, and even nations. But in this litany, I suppose, of Arne Jacobsen, Dansk, Marimekko, Alvar Aalto, of course, Eliasson is calling directly upon the canon. I would have to say that most of you who have arrived here with some sense of Nordic design would be instantly familiar with those references. But if I would ask you to close your eyes and set aside this canon of almost high design references, imagine the everyday American citizen going into Walmart and having to understand the Nordic presence in their life if they were in fact only able to shop at Walmart. I undertook this exercise for Finland in 2017 when Finland celebrated 100 years of independence in an exhibition that I did at the Embassy of Finland in Washington, D.C., which really attempted just that. What if all we had as we went into the world's largest retailer superstore, all we had were spectacles that allowed us to see only things that were made in Finland. For this exercise, only things that were made in the Nordic nations. What might that be if you were to close your eyes, put on those spectacles? What would we find that is at hand, directly part of our everyday lives? Because that's almost, I would say, as important as this room and this building and all the buildings and all the canons that we come to bear. Anyone help? This is audience participation. What am I going to find? Yes? Sorry? I'm sorry, my ear. Paper clips, yes? Okay. What else would be of Nordic design? Okay, what else? All right. Wood salad bowls. How about children's toys? The most ubiquitous plastic brick in the world. Lego, yes? Now Walmart is not yet crossed its own domain into flat pack furniture, but we know already that they are in some competition with that Swedish brand as well, right? Outdoor wear, Helly Hansen from Norway, right? And of course in Finland, which I know well, the orange-handled scissors from Fiskars, which are of which Walmart sells truly 1 billion of those in any given year. But that's not the most important thing, I would say, for those of us who enjoy the outdoors. The most sold object of design in this particular context are fishing lures by Rapala, so also made and designed in Finland. I only want to suggest that even if we didn't have the canon, so to speak, the canon of Jakobsen or the canon of Aalto or the canon of Dansken Marimekko, Nordic design would be part of us whether we knew it or not. So please put that into your minds, that we are living, whether we know it or not, and I hope we like it though, we are all living in the Nordic world here in the United States. Now we need, of course, here in New York to cast ourselves into 60 degrees north latitude and understand that while this is Scandinavia House, of course it is actually Nordic House, and that this includes Finland and Sweden and Norway and Denmark and the Faroe Islands and the Åland Islands and also Iceland, right? It includes all of this, at least in a mapped way. But perhaps if we were to have this in a much more romantic way and maybe in an instructive way, it's also this. And Rosalie already mentioned the references to the natural world, the references to light of a certain character, the references to immediate resources to be drawn from that natural world. All of that perhaps could be bound up in this. And of course, this is recorded over and over and over again in Nordic painting, in Nordic poetry, in Nordic theater, in Nordic literature, and certainly in Nordic architecture, this referencing back always to the natural environment. Now we will come at the close of my remarks to perhaps the inverse of this, but this is very much, if we were to look through the history of these images, going all the way back into the 17th, 18th, certainly 19th century and moving into the 20th century, the natural world is that reference point for thinking about Nordic art, architecture, and design. Tapio Virkala, Milan Triennale, mid-1950s. This object was on view. This object was also on view here in New York City in an exhibition, Design in Scandinavia, traveled across the country For the time, House Beautiful declared this, as some know, the most beautiful object in the world. Rather, all-encompassing statement. But here too, the natural references, the craft references, the resource references, the textural references, the phenomena of holding this in your hand was very much a part of its appeal at that particular point in time. Equally, one could say that this, the Savoy vase, designed by Aalto in the 1937 for the Paris World's Fair, has itself become a signifier on multiple levels. Of course, it's a vase made of glass, blown, now molded, now made in a ubiquitous fashion. It's in the MoMA gift shop, but believe me, it's also for sale in grocery stores in Finland at the same time. So it has this kind of ubiquitous presence. But it's a signifier now for the mark of the Aaltos, Aino and Alvar, who designed it. It's a signifier of Finnish architecture and design. And in many ways, it's a signifier of Finland itself, such as the power of this simple design, but also, I think, the power of Nordic architecture and design altogether. These are the hands of Arne Jacobsen designing a piece of dansk tableware, again, to emphasize the presence of the hand as well as the relationship of the artisan to industrial processes of manufacture. And in these smaller nations, I say that respectfully across the 5 nations in particular, that relationship between craft economies and industrial economies is very close. And the shift, the movement from something that might seem a one-off in furniture or a one-off in tableware, its movement directly into industrial manufacturing can be extremely swift and very productive and quite invigorating as a designer. This is where Jacobsen's ant chairs, as he said, once upon a time, as they had come into production, and he was testing their structure and threw them across the room and said, "We're going to make 1 million of these." And of course, they've gone on to make many, many more because of their quality of design. Marimekko too has its own brand-like quality as well. But I want to bring this back to New York, let's say, because the presence of Aalto in New York is important to note. He was already exhibiting the work of both he and his wife Aino in the early mid-1930s, but it was in 1939 at the World's Fair in Flushing Meadows when he produced this interior design for Finland, for its pavilion, its interior pavilion for that World's Fair. And this is where Finland comes, in a sense, of age. Even if Elio Saarinen is already here, as Tod will probably refer to as he discusses Cranbrook, Aalto comes of age here in the United States, falls in love with New York, and becomes good friends with the Rockefellers and so forth. And in 1939, of course, the world is already in conflict. And this was an important moment for Finland to be declaring its independence and declaring its vitality, but certainly to do this demonstratively through this crafted interior with all of its production demonstrated, with all the work of its citizens displayed photographically on the walls. All of this becomes an extreme example of Nordic presence now in the United States. I'll note just a couple more things before coming to more contemporary topics. Rosalie already mentioned as well the emphasis on craft, and as I've said, its relationship to industrial economies or industrial manufacturing. And yet there's always, I would say, embedded in this emphasis on detail, something of a narrative, something of an understanding not only of the material, but of the building programs that those details serve. I know Tom will touch on this in his own work, and Tod has done this in their own work. But one of the most tell-the-tale details, so to speak, to be found in the Nordic countries are these door handles. Door handles that adorn one of the actually lesser entrances of the Stockholm Public Library, designed by the Swedish architect Erik Gunnar Asplund in 1925-26. These are cast of bronze, And perhaps you know that or you can recognize that as you enter the library, you are grasping the body of Eve, who is holding the apple towards you. And as you leave the library, you are grasping the body of Adam, who has already bitten the apple. This narrative is embedded in the, I would say, almost, again, the, the frisson of touching the human body at that scale in bronze, one way or the other, and giving you a sense of what lies within and what you take with you when you leave. But this emphasis on the narrative detail, this emphasis on the crafted detail, this is what I would argue is present in this building as well, and what surely appealed to Mr. Gallagher and his colleagues on the board as they commissioned Jim Polsek, because he too, coming from his studies in Denmark, was suffused with this understanding of detail and construction. The last thing I'll show in this sequence is really, for me, where I understood all of this to be important in my own work and my own thinking. This is the interior of a church in the south of Sweden, designed by the architect Sigurd Leverance, at that point in his life already in his mid-1980s, a church entirely designed and constructed out of Swedish brick, floor, ceilings, walls, and so forth. And the only time that this brick changes in its patterning is when it has to open up for an aperture such as a window, or in this case, in this church, an aperture for the baptismal font. It is such an intense focus on one particular material with a very few significant details, with a high premium placed on the admission and control of natural light, as well as in this case, artificial illumination through candles. And you have to imagine that in this baptismal font, there is one small spigot that drips water into this giant conch shell. And if you're there by yourself, one drop goes into the shell and one drop goes down into the abyss of the brick, echoing in the church. This type of phenomenal approach, thinking about architecture through our senses, is again another aspect that I would emphasize to you that begins to have value as it transfers here into the United States. Now, if we take this as a synapse, but let's move into the contemporary moment quickly, because all of those canonical architects, all of those canonical buildings, all of those canonical references to design have a place still, but of course these are now vastly different societies and design cultures still with those roots. And I show here the Svalbard Research Center in the very, very far north of Norway, actually on the island of Svalbard, of Spitsbergen, a building designed by the Norwegian practice of Jarmund Vigsnes, which itself has been designed to adapt to climate, to respond to climate, the harsh climate certainly of the North Pole. And at the same time, I show, also within the Norwegian context, the Oslo Opera House, an indication of this nation and of this city's commitment to understanding itself more and more as an urban capital, more and more through its harbor front, more and more through its cultural iconic buildings. This is Snøhetta. Snøhetta, I'm quite sure Craig Dykers and others will be here later in this series to talk about their work here in the United States. But if that's a development that has occurred in Oslo through the contemporary Norwegian culture, we can also remark upon similar changes that have been underway in Copenhagen and in Denmark itself over the last 20 to 30 years. This is, of course, the harbor baths designed by Big, as it was at the time, one of the very first demonstrations of Copenhagen's commitment to redeveloping its harbor and bringing, in fact, all of the edges of that harbor back into public life. And here, apologies for the borrowed photograph, but here further evidence of this nation's commitment and this capital city's commitment to revitalizing its harbor front, its waterways. It is possible, again, to swim now in this harbor, but Opera House at the far end, National Theater on the left, these are newer buildings, again, that structure now Copenhagen's harbor, that give a sense of pride and purpose to the harbor and to the capital city. It's an ongoing, long-term project around which now housing and other cultural amenities are rapidly developing. This has also been happening in Reykjavik, in Iceland. This is Harpa, a concert hall, performing arts center, done together with Olafur Eliasson in the Reykjavik harbor. Here too, much smaller nation, but still committed to identifying itself in contemporary terms, identifying itself through the revitalization of its harbor front, identifying itself to the world through performance and culture more generally. And of course, this is now happening against the backdrop of other changes that are happening in the Icelandic landscape, and there's much to be seen, I think much to be understood as to what will come from that. But this is then, lastly, happening in Helsinki as well, the revitalization of its harbor front, most recently a new building for the world's largest biomaterial producer, Stora Enso. This is an all-wood mass timber building, headquarters on the harbor front itself. You see, if you've been to Helsinki or know some of its images, you see the iconic cathedral there to the left. And then just opposite from that new building, soon there will be the newly commissioned Architecture and Design Museum, a combination of two institutions of long-standing competition that has just been resolved and has been awarded to the Finnish architecture practice, JKMM. But here too, a capital city and a nation very interested in promoting itself through culture, through architecture, and through the revitalization of its harbor front. We see this lastly in Stockholm and Sweden as well, in the designs of Slussen, the lock complex in the middle of the city, and then in entire new districts, Wood City, Stockholm, being brought into being, deeply ecological, deeply sustainable in their design, deeply drawing upon the forest resources of Sweden to bring this out into the urban condition. All of this to say is that, yes, those canonical design references remain. Yes, we could have wonderful conversations about the value of Aalto's furniture or about the value of Jakobsen's furniture. But for me, at this point now, at the far end of this several centuries of development in Nordic architecture and design, if we're talking about its relevance to what we are trying to do here in this country, in our architecture and design, which these two architects are deeply involved in, you have now Nordic nations that are committing to immediate action in climate resilience. And this is Helsinki's carbon neutral plan, setting a goal of 2035. And Copenhagen, in fact, has been saying this year itself. They are not alone. Sweden has set these goals for itself. Iceland is setting these goals for itself. Norway is setting the goals for itself, despite their reliance, of course, on North Sea oil. All of these nations have committing themselves to climate resilience through architecture and design. And this is what brings me back ultimately to this reference to nature, but it's now nature re-understood as something that we are deeply responsible for, that we are utterly reliant on as a society, that we need to be moving towards through architecture and design. I had the privilege of writing about this in 2012 for the Louisiana Museum as they did an exhibition on new Nordic architecture. And my closing statement is where I'll leave this tonight. How should we assess a society? Perhaps best by a society's care for its children, for its elderly, for the less advantaged, by its equitable provision of a full quality of life to all, and thus ultimately by its architecture, its social art. And how should we assess its culture? By a culture's cultivation of literacy, education, and physical and mental well-being, and thus ultimately by architecture, its social art. Such is the importance of the Nordic architect's sense of social responsibility, and such is the continuing value of Nordic architecture. And this is the evidence, briefly outlined for you here, of a Nordic sense of culture and community. And as I was taught to say in Fayetteville, Arkansas, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Peter, that was wonderful. We've known each other a long time. My talk will be a little different, but it's great to be here. Nice to be in a space that Jim designed, and I often go to Zankel Hall and love the texture of the wood at Zankel Hall. It's a beautiful space. I miss Jim. I was lucky enough to, I don't know how this goes on, really talk with microphone. Can you hear me? No. Peter, how do I turn this down? Yeah. Is it on? Okay. This is the drawing of Eliel Saarinen of Cranbrook when he first came to the country, actually invited after the coming in second in the Chicago Tribute Tower competition. He had left Finland because actually the Finnish nationalism that he had worked on with his partners was beginning to find a different kind of challenge, in as much as there was a kind of a new modern European classicism emerging. But he found a home in Cranbrook. George Booth and his wife promoted having him come there, and you can see if you look carefully at this, you'll see the Vitkaresque home that he designed for him and his partners outside of Finland. So this, interestingly, I was born in Detroit, but grew up in the suburbs as the suburbs were being sidewalked over and wood frame buildings were going up. My parents had 4 kids in a tight pattern, and I was lucky enough to be sent to Cranbrook School at the age of 3 to get out of my parents' hair, and then managed to be on that campus for the next 15 years. Became a Cub Scout there, became an Audubon member, learned to swim, learned to become a lifeguard, learned to do a lot of things. I still go back there because my brother and sister live nearby. Next. Or am I advancing these? Who's advancing these? Peter, how did you, this guy? You lecture so much more than I do. And these are the buildings there. And one of the things that we see here is the warmth and the sense of enclosure, the richness of the materials Peter's talked about, and the commitment to nature and arts and crafts. To me, this is what I grew up in. I was not taught it. I simply loved every moment. I still do. So I find that this is a deep and powerful influence on my life. And this is the Cranbrook Academy of Art, done a number of years later. Saarinen is beginning to find other influences, just as Aalto did, that were more modern, at the same time also including references to Frank Lloyd Wright and obviously classicism. Here we have Carl Millis's sculptures embedded in the campus. And actually a very important aspect of Finnish design, and as you said, Nordic design, is the interiors. It's a cold place. People are deeply invested in the sense of craft, place, home, and interiors have always been important to me. Certainly this is at Cranbrook. I was lucky enough to go to Rome at the age of 40 at the American Academy. I hadn't really been to Rome before. And there I began to become much more aware of European architecture, and began to think back about how Cranbrook might have affected me, and that I'd like to build buildings that lasted and buildings that were committed to the earth. After that trip, 10 years after that trip, Juhani Palsma invited me to teach in Finland. And I spent a winter time in Finland, actually in his home, and taught his classes as he taught at Yale. That's the time I really began to understand what Aalto might mean to me, and how Aalto actually connected to the same sort of Finnish architecture that I just showed you. This is Sanet Salo, a wonderful little city center with a sense of interiority and a kind of monumental parked against a deeply detailed and gently scaled interior. I might have shown Bill and Myrea for this too. Both had the same kinds of roots, not the shaped vases that we saw, and also think of Aalto, but this stuff that's very, very simple and deeply rooted. I also was able then to teach at Cooper Union with Sarah Fenn, And he invited me over to Norway, to his home, and then began to understand Sverre Fenn's work and appreciation of Le Corbusier, and also his connection to the land and landscape. And of course, this is the the Nordic Pavilion at the Venice Biennale that Sverre did in 1962, a totally sublime building. Completely abstract. It's always kind of wondrous how this building could have been made. But this too is influential in the work. And as Peter's already shown, Woodland Cemetery, and actually Tom will show, I know in a moment, this visiting the Woodland Cemetery in Asplund and Leverance's work there was incredible. What we see here is, again, this sort of abstraction and in a way, neoclassicism that's connected back to history, but also deeply invested in an appreciation of a harmony with nature. And the sky plane. I think the sky plane is always important when you're in the north, whether it's reaching for the light as we see here, or simply finding a way by which it's connecting actually to the incredible sort of history that we have in architecture altogether. This is could be easily also a reference to the Pantheon. And then, of course, the Louisiana Museum, which was by Jürgen Boe and Olsons. That to me, the most beautiful museum there is, actually, because of its way that it weaves through the landscape and brings landscape together with the place you are, a sense of masonry and solidity and simple lines. Interior always in a dialogue with the exterior. So in 1999, doing a first building at Cranbrook, I thought of how this building could be quiet in the land and could say something about water and nature and texture. The indoor swimming pool is not air conditioned, as all pools are, but naturally conditioned by large panels which open and close and are naturally ventilating the space. And then I look at this image and I know that I was looking at Leverance when I was thinking about this back in the late 90s. And the interior, which is actually simultaneously serene and clear and competitive and a fast pool to swim in, but a beautiful place to swim in. Actually says that water is essential matter, and so too is the sky. We did a project in Baltimore, and it's the Matin Center. It was also, you can see, it's an art center that was formed around a place where a student had been murdered, and the student was very, very committed to the arts, theater, which is in the center, and unfortunately this is no longer there. A building by BIG is in its place, but it has obviously some of the qualities of Signet Salo. Found that we made landscapes that's brought in simultaneously set apart and connected, or a house in the 90s where the owners wanted something that was quiet in the land and could be natural with connections to the landscape nearby. Obviously, it's an interior that feels like it's warm and gentle. The kitchen, which has an ability to look to the dining room, to the living room, to the landscape. More recently at Princeton, the Enlinger Center, here we tried to make a building of brick. In this case, it's Peterson brick from Denmark, but trying to make a brick that looked very much like concrete, and at the same time working with Michael van Valkenburg to make sure that this was really an experience of a garden as much as it was a laboratory. So these are all set deep within the ground, and people wander and meander through this, and I was pleased to be there just a week ago and found that the gardens, even in the wintertime, are beautiful, and people use them as a way to pass through the campus. Details on the inside, I think, are some part of our work to try to say a person made this. A person has a sense of place. These are clear references, at least in my mind, to what I learned at Cranbrook. Pavilion in Prospect Park, the largest pavilion, a skating pavilion, which is a green roof and a canopy that, again, deals with the issue of the sky plane and bringing craft and the hand into something that's very much part of the landscape, I think, but is a useful space. And then most recently, this is a project right underneath the Brooklyn Bridge, where these solar panels, which are the ones that are lightest, are all active solar panels. The others are not, have pipes going through them. But we're looking down from the bridge onto the canopy, working once again with Michael van Valkenburg. This really rest stations, toilets, I should say, and a place to catch a bite and stand up and look at the beautiful surroundings. The Brooklyn Bridge, it's now lifted up off the floodplain by 5.5 feet and made of stone and tiles, and trying to simply be a place in the land. So, that's it. Thank you all.
Let me see. Hello, everyone. It's so nice to be here to talk to you guys tonight. I do love Jim's room here. What an amazing person he was. And he was always pushing me ahead, I have to say. He was like a guardian angel for me. So it's really an honor to be here in his building today. I wanted to talk a little bit about my experiences with Nordic architecture. I visited the Scandinavian countries in 1976, when I was traveling around Europe, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and finally taking the big boat over to Helsinki, the overnight boat, because we couldn't really afford a hotel there. And I think we spent a whole month up there, and I don't think those memories are ever forgotten. They have been completely cemented into my treasury of precedents. And in putting all of this together, it just all came flooding out. All of the things that I saw there and experienced in those countries really just came roaring back. And I think I ended up in Helsinki and ran out of money. Family wouldn't send me anymore. I think I had to hitchhike to the airport to get back to the United States. So it was quite an amazing experience back then, because we saw so much and it felt so different than the architecture that we had seen in the rest of the year that I had spent in Europe. So I just wanted to go through some topics here that I have wanted to speak about actually for a long time in relationship to one another. And the first one is light, shade, and shadow, and deep shadow. Shade, shadow, and deep shadow, they belong to the light. They're not separate from the light, but they belong to the light. And it was only a year and a half ago that I visited this remarkable church outside of Copenhagen. And I happened to be there on a day when there was some sunshine and then a cloud would come over. And I sat in this remarkable place, and it was like a vitrine of light. When the sun would come out, the place would be completely filled. It was like this burst of light. And then when the sun would go behind the cloud, you would begin to get this shade and shadow. And in some cases, deep shadow. And I sat there, I must have been in one of those little chairs for an hour, maybe longer, watching the sun move in this place and feeling the radiance of the day. It is just a reminder of this remarkable place that really tunes and captures the light. It is like a catalyst for appreciating the light. And so certainly we have learned that in working on the Glenstone Museum. We have this journey that goes around the pool into each one of the galleries. And once you leave a room, you come out into this passage. And we wanted this passage to be a journey in light, a journey through light and shade and shadow and deep shadow. So you can see here one of the rooms to the right as you go from light, shadow, and then you move into the light into a room. Then you go into another room, the Bryce Martin room that's there through deep shadow, and you go into the room that's filled with light. So the whole journey around is this journey through light and all the way to deep shadow and darkness. And then this other church that I remember visiting when I was a student, where the light seems to come over your shoulder. This place, it was so mysterious to me, how this beautiful burst of light lit the center of the church there, and how the light, how the architecture was tuned to understand the movement and the changing light. This happened to be on a Sunday morning there, and it was the most mysterious building because on the outside of the building, this exterior form is all rectilinear. It's all these rectilinear volumes. And you can see inside how it's sculpted to receive and to move the light. It's all about the light and the shade and the shadow, and how the shadow begins to collect in some of these areas that are down below. These little bursts of light that are coming through in the way that the ceiling separates there. This was just a huge lesson for me, but look at that section. And then, of course, I couldn't leave this topic without Alto's church. This happened to be in Italy, not in the Nordic region, but how the light again is coming in and celebrating the structure and celebrating this light from the heavens. I think this was on a Sunday morning too, how the light just completely fills this as again a vitrine of light. And this is a house that we're doing that's in Texas. That is an art house. And right in the middle of the house is a big room that connects all of the different areas of the house. And in that room, it's all top lit. With this, taking a clue from the church, the chapel, where the light is just coming over your shoulder and softly coming down and holding the light within this room. The next topic is what I call the eyes of the skin. The eyes of the skin is touch. This sense that we have of placing your hand on something, walking over something, understanding what your skin feels. And I have had this pinned up in my office for a long time. It's this beautiful handrail that Alto made, happened to make it in Russia, but he has done this handrail in so many different places that I saw when I was a student. And you can see it's sculpted. It's sculpted for the hand to embrace it, so that you touch the wood, the warmth of the wood, and you feel like the wood is embracing you. That moment that you feel you're a part of the architecture. You're a part of moving through the architecture by holding on to something that is protective. He also did the most remarkable door handles that he wrapped in leather. So everything as you moved through his architecture that you touched, he embraced that touch, wanted you to feel the little strips of leather. He wanted you to feel the wood so that when you moved through his architecture, you had on you the eyes of the skin. And so at Glenstone, this is a pretty good reference here from Alto's work. We took this one stairway, it's the one handrail in the building, as you descend down into the peninsula there to walk around this pool at Glenstone. You walk and you touch this handrail as you lower yourself down to all of the galleries. And then this was important, and I actually couldn't find this image. I'd been looking for this image that has been really important to me, and somehow it's lost to me. But I titled this Tectonics, and I should title it Tectonics and Structure, because this is Eero Saarinen back in 1951. This is his General Motors Technical Center that's here. And what he did is he was pioneering back with Arne Jacobsen. This is 1956. Arne Jacobsen. This is the one detail I could find where he combines the support of the window wall. So this is like a mullion for him. It connects the window wall together, but it also supports the floor above. So he's using this particular T-shaped section for both, and clearly it's taking the wind as well. So he combines those two activities into one smaller detail. And so as we worked on this house on Fisher's Island, we took and we had to deal with 130 mile an hour hurricane winds, and we had to deal with the weight of the roof, with its snow loads. And so here, the mullion itself has a little piece of its 2 3/4 of an inch, but it's a solid piece of steel. And that piece of steel holds and contains the window wall. So it takes those lateral forces there, and it also supports the roof. This was only given birth through Saarinen's work. And then materials. How could we ever live? And I'm teaching this semester at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm teaching an architecture studio there. And I walk by this twice a week, coming and going from the train station there. And I just marvel at this building that Saarinen did back in 1960. Look at the way this brick reflects how it was made, the craft in this brick that seems to come directly from that sense of this Nordic tradition of craft. Look at how each brick seems like it's handmade. It seems like it's handmade, and it's laid. It looks like people have laid it. It's not that precise, but you feel this masonry wall and this simple rhythmic series of windows. I mean, it has been one of the joys of going down there to Philadelphia once a week, just to walk around this building. It was built in 1960, and it still looks like it was. I mean, it is a real masterpiece that Saarinen built. And Saarinen also in 1956, he used this brick again. And look at the mortar and the bricks, the way he asked the masons to lay it, the way that you can feel how the brick was fired, how taking the brick out of the oven was not a precise formula there. It really begins to speak about how it's made as this sense of craft. And this is this little house that we made in Madison, Wisconsin, where we took this brick from a pile of bricks outside of Chicago. And they were brought to Madison, Wisconsin. I had just been, before we started working on the project, I had just been to UVA. And I saw Thomas Jefferson's beautiful garden walls. And this site happened to be a found site. It was the backyards of two sites in historic Madison. And so this site was a garden site, and it occurred to me to take the house and make it a garden wall. And Jefferson was not Nordic, so of Nordic origin, so I didn't include his beautiful walls, which are, spectacular. But we wanted to take this tradition of the brick, this handmade brick, and make it this garden wall that was weaving this site back to its roots as a garden. And then this abstraction. This is a rather petite building, the MIT chapel that Sheridan did. But I sit here on the grass every time I go there that with this petiteness comes this sense of monumentality. I feel like this is a remarkably monumental building. It's a pure form. It's a cylinder. And it has this beautiful sense of scale and texture, this handmade quality. Look at these arches there that form its base. It looks as light as air when it lands on these little tiny vaults. It's a remarkable building. And when we were working on the Glenstone project, I was just hugely blessed with a private audience when we went down with our amazing clients to see Cy Twombly in Virginia. And I pinned up our charcoal drawing there of what we were planning. And Cy Twombly wanted it pinned up on the wall, and he sat there and stared at it, I don't know, for 20 minutes. I was wondering, what in the world is he looking at? And he came to me, and he said very quietly, he said, "Trust the abstraction." Boy, that took a year to get over that comment. But from a guy coming from the work he did to tell me that was, I think, really ended up shaping this project, this sense of abstraction, and sitting in front of that MIT chapel. And then, of course, connection to the land and to the landscape. I'm using Todd's slide here. I don't know of an architect who's made a museum who doesn't put the Louisiana at the top of the list. Every one of them. Every single one of them. It connects the light and the land and the landscape to the art. It connects that all experience together. It is a remarkable place. And at Glenstone, we went back and back to the Louisiana to find out how to drink that water, to drink that Kool-Aid. And here, when you come out of a room, you sit on a bench and you have this experience of sitting by this garden and preparing yourself through time and distance to come and have the next experience in the next room. And of course, we've all shown this cemetery that I experienced when I was a student. And here is this same experience where you're walking in the land, and they made this deliberately long, where you're walking and you're moving your arms and you're moving your legs. You feel your feet on the path. You feel yourself moving through nature, and all of a sudden, you begin to prepare. You begin to speak less. You begin to quiet yourself, particularly at the cemetery before the chapel. There is this preparatory moment by moving through this beautiful landscape with those honey locust trees that sit on the hill. It really doesn't get much better than that. 1940, can you imagine? 1940. And then this experience, we went back to the to the cemetery to look at this experience as we were working on Glenstone, this notion of parking, preparing, walking through the landscape, and preparing for this art experience in these rooms that sit embedded in the land. And then finally, atmosphere. One of my favorite moments when I sit on the lawn, I always go through Saarinen's beautiful passage here that comes into the chapel that seems like the light metaphorically and physically is coming from the heavens down into this quiet space. It creates this remarkable silence here. And we tried to create that silence in this one room at Glenstone. After you've gone through half of the rooms there, you come into this room, you sit, you get framed by the landscape. When you frame something, it heightens the experience there. So we wanted this to be a place of pause and contemplation, and the atmosphere is actually framed in the heightened experience of the land. So that's it. I'll turn it over to Rosalie.
Is this on? How do you tell that it's on?
Hello?
It's on, okay. Those were really beautiful presentations. I have some questions that are pretty kind of broad and abstract for you. And they come out of thinking that both the architecture and design that you showed that is the source of influence is so beautiful, and the architecture that Tod and Tom showed is so beautiful. The quality that it shares for me is a kind of modesty and a maybe quietness, which is paradoxical because certainly Glenstone and some of the projects that you showed, Tom, they're not simple projects, they're not modest in terms of budget, but there's a modesty and a quietness that I wonder if you would talk a little bit more about how, about that attitude and how you see that attitude in our contemporary landscape. And I told you it was kind of broad in general, but it's such a powerful aspect of the architecture, both the earlier and the work that you showed. And it is so contrary to so much of what gets created today.
Well, first, I'm humbled by the work of others. All of this work humbles me enormously. I did as a child. And I think today there's so much that is out there that is produced quickly and can be produced almost immediately, or seems to, certainly because of the speed with which society is supposedly moving forward, that I find that it's, for me, that's a lifesaver to hang on to, feeling humbled by life, and I can't explain why people would want to race forward as quickly as they seem to want to do. The internet is, well, we'll all survive. I won't survive. I think it's natural for us to feel that way. Maybe it's because we're older. We've seen a lot of life, and certainly looking at the past allows us to really reflect on the work that went before. I remember going outside of Copenhagen to the open air museum, which showed Nordic structures as they were built hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and they were as beautiful as the work that we saw from the last 100 years, maybe more so.
You certainly think about that month that I spent in those countries up north, and I arrived in Finland in April when at 3 o'clock in the morning it was bright. And you spend decades and decades trying to understand the promise of light and the promise of what it means to experience light. And I think I went through all of those alto buildings when light was just pouring in a place that in the winter months doesn't have much light. And I think over the years we have tried to develop a language that involves more reductive volumes so that it lives in the moving light, moving and changing light. And so one would hope that we would get our buildings more silent as they begin to move and change in this ever-changing daylight. And that was really born in those Nordic countries so many years ago. But you get to be older and you just, you finally start to get it after all these years.
So Peter, I have a kind of different kind of question for you. I kept, babbling on about forests and trees and so on. Juhani Palasma says in describing talking about the differences between Norway and Denmark and Sweden and Finland, he talks about Finland as a place where the forest is the home, and that there's a sense of whether this is still currently so true or not, I don't know, but that a sense of comfort and connection and belonging to the forest. And I'm curious both whether that you sense that still is the case, but also with your own work on wood and on the timber industry in Arkansas, whether you see not only the kind of economic possibilities in wood in Arkansas and the sustainability possibilities, but is there a sense of connection in some sort of parallel way?
Yeah. I want to step half back to your earlier question to Tod and Tom, which is, I think it's possible, and surely in one of the later conversations, to at least provide an alternate understanding of these cultures of architectural restraint that there is always in my experience in these architecture cultures, very expressive architects, and meaning formally speaking, I'm doing this, but who are in a way resisting what might be the more dominant tendencies towards restraint and kind of gravity and so on. And that's a topic for another conversation, but what is coming back to the question of these sort of forest cultures, despite the fact that Denmark and Norway and Sweden especially have long monarchy traditions, right? There's a long political tradition of a certain hierarchical society, which Finland does not have and Iceland does not have. But these are primarily cultures which come forward out of agricultural rural economies, come out in which there's a very strong thread of vernacular architecture and its relevance still. And to a very large extent, of course, these are or have been historically Lutheran, not just Protestant, but Lutheran cultures as well. And all of this, I think, has a relevance when we talk about restraint, and we talk about humility, and we talk about and how that has architectural dimension. That looking at the church, the Grundtvig Church in Copenhagen, this is a Lutheran church, let's be clear, in which there is not going to be any decoration on those walls whatsoever, other than what is there possible in the brick and in the masonry, and then in how that shapes the admission of light altogether. So it's possible to talk about where does this restraint and humility and gravity and appreciation of how things are made come from. And that's what's always, I think, quite fascinating to think about too, is that when you do not have a lot, or when what you have has to be extracted at great labor and with great energy or at great cost, you are going to make the most of it, even with the least amount of material possible. So I say that because I think this is something to be examined looking across the Nordic region and how that has architectural evidence. Specifically to your question then, it's of course, yes, commonly thought of it. Finland has a very strong forest economy. Again, it's part of an agricultural approach. Sweden does too. Norway does too. Denmark, you could say, is not heavily forested, but of course the crafting of wood from furniture to houses to larger and larger buildings now is very much a part of their architectural culture. I think the danger we have to avoid is that there is a mythology of the forest, and then there is the sheer facts of it, and they're not exclusive, which is to say we can find a certain romantic character in that nature, and again it's present in many of the painted works and literary works and so forth. But in the end, it's also, for many people, it's their livelihood. Right? And so the management of those forests and the cultivation of them for economic purpose, whether it's for architecture or for railroad ties or for the ship masts, is this constant tension. We have to, we see ourselves identifiably in that forest, and at the same time, we know that we have to take that forest down in order to survive. So I think that's where, if I was to bring this back to your question, is that possible here in the United States? Is it possible in the great southeastern forests or even in the northwestern forests? There's a wonderful book which I rely on an awful lot called American Canopy by a faculty member at University of South Florida, Eric Rutkoff, in which he says that without understanding the forest, you will understand nothing about the United States, that it is so much a nation that is indebted to the forest as a resource and the forest as wilderness and the forest as identity, that in it is embedded every issue that we've had to face as a nation. To bring this to a very fine point in Arkansas, as in Finland too, the forests are growing too much for their own health. And so we have to manage them better, and to see them as an economic resource is extremely important. But we can see them both as an environment to be addressed, environmental dangers to be addressed, and as a source of economy to be addressed. And this is what, when people say, how are you doing this in Arkansas, and what did you learn from your time in the Nordic countries? I go, precisely that unless we see what's lying in front of us, that this is one of our greatest natural resources, which is our responsibility to steward and then to bring to bear upon how we develop as a culture, we will always be somewhere either thinking of it instrumentally as a resource to be extracted, or utterly romantically and mythologically, which at this point is no longer as I think as useful as it used to be. So again, I'm going on here only to say that we see now a great deal of the efforts in advancing low carbon economies, low carbon construction, low carbon engineering, low carbon architecture is all coming out of Northern Europe and the Nordic nations in particular, as well as from the Black Forests of Germany and Austria. And my contention is that we should be doing this ourselves here in the US in our own low carbon economies too. Sorry to go on at length, but this is the lessons, and I think that's where we have lessons to be learned about what are these good people doing in the Nordic nations that we can learn from here? A lot. And it's at the scale of the hand, but it's also at the scale of economic development.
We're close to 9 o'clock. We can take a couple of questions maybe from the audience, if anybody has a question. Yes, back there.
I have a question. Thank you for the presentation. It's very insightful. I have to ask, being from the Nordic countries myself, most of your examples were from the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and 60s. Some contemporary examples as well. And of course, it's very understandable, especially in the 1930s and 40s, and 50s as well. The lighting, in a sense, came from the north, and there was a combination of Nordic design and design in Scandinavia exhibition in 1947, had a huge influence, and the architects of Billie and others. But how do you see contemporary Nordic design and architecture and that role influence in the US?
Just to say before you all answered, the program was framed for us by our absent program curator as how has Nordic modernism, precisely an earlier period influenced your thinking and modernism in general. But anyway, with that.
But sorry, is the question then, how do we see contemporary
Yes.
Nordic architecture and design? Well, having been writing about contemporary Nordic architecture since 1990, maybe I'll hazard a few assessments here, because I think the tendency that we have sometimes as architects and certainly as historians is to periodize and say, well, that's contemporary and that's modernism and that's so on. I tend to see this as a continuum in large part because I'm not even sure that Tod or Tom would say that they're a contemporary architect. I think that they are working in a continuum of time that attaches their work to vernacular precedents as much as to modernism, as much as in one kind of dialogue even with neoclassicism of a certain type. So, but this is where I wanted in my own images to indicate that there's a very vital contemporary architecture that's occurring now, that commissions being awarded quite publicly to younger practices to represent civic identity and potentially national identity. And one of the ways in which this is happening, which is unfortunately not as present in this country as it should be, is through a very vigorous competition system. Any building with public funds is usually now still subject to an open competition, which allows you as a student of architecture as much as a licensed professional to enter in and to contend for rather significant public buildings and to, in a way, start your career that way and start a practice that way. It's not so possible here. There's other factors at play. But the contemporary condition, in my view, is very much energized by that. But even of longer standing, I think, is what I hinted at in my last quote, which is this deep sense of societal obligation. that that ethos is still present. So whether you think of yourself as a younger, contemporary, just starting, inexperienced, you know that your responsibility is to build well on behalf of society for the long duration. And that comes through education, and it comes through the cultural context, and it comes through the competition system, and so on. So yes, there's a contemporary architecture that's occurring, and it's present and it's available, and I think there's a later session in which some of those practices will be identified. And yet, at the same time, those contemporary architects very much understand the tradition in which they're working and the responsibilities they have, not only to that tradition, but to the society in which they're situated.
Something that I read that made a big impression on me in preparing a bit for this was, I think, again, from Juhani Palasma, but the idea that in building for the public in the Nordic countries, the obligation is to set a high standard as a model for what is built by others for other purposes, so that, I mean, if only we could aspire to that here. I think there's a reception, I think, outside, and a chance to ask more questions directly.
And I want to thank you all. It has been illuminating. Thank you all very much. And the next in the series will be on the 15th of January. And the speakers are Nordic and New York. I mean, the topic is Nordic and New York. Speakers are Craig Dykers and Stephen Hall. And we'll have one more architect, I think, to be announced. But I hope you'll all come back then. And thank you all again. It was really great.